While the Fallout series has spanned multiple decades and many locations, each with their own wonders and horrors, one of the constants in the series has been power armor. Probably the most recognizable aspect of Fallout, it's on almost every game cover. Yet the specific availability, capability, and role of each suit of power armor is often confused even within the games itself, thanks to, of course, the retcons. So with this video, I intend to explain and try to fix all of the retcons as best I can. Now it should be noted that I am basing a lot of information off 76 because it's the latest game in the franchise, so it's Bethesda's current canon. But before you throw up your arms in disgust at this heresy, remember, if you've watched my video about 76 power armor, it does a pretty good job of fixing Fallout 4's issues. Not saying it's perfect, but definitely a massive improvement over Fallout 4. Before I start with any of the actual retcons or lore breaks, it's important to understand the state of America before the war and how power armor fits in. By the time of the Great War in 2077, America had been at war with China for around 11 years, with power armor being around almost as long. America was draining its own remaining resources to push the fight against China overseas. Power armor was essentially their best ground weapon, and most of it would be sent overseas. America was also plagued with social unrest and riots. The military was often deployed to quell the riots. We can see that the East Coast has significantly more power armor than the West Coast. This is likely due to 3 reasons. First, the East Coast had a higher population pre-war and should have been bombed significantly more, resulting in not only more power armor suits, but more suits per person. Second, the East appears to have a larger export of power armor. Specifically in Boston, we see many suits being transported likely overseas to the front lines. But of course many of them still remain in Boston. Thirdly, while power armor was used for riot control on the East Coast, the West had a different approach. They used variations of regular military armor. We can see this in New Vegas with the veteran ranger armor being formed from old LAPD riot gear. Then in the Divide, the military also had similar riot gear. It's safe to assume that this supplemented power armor in the West in terms of riot control at least. The first thing we'll start with is kind of the basis of power armor, the chassis and the fusion core. This concept was first properly introduced in Fallout 4. Unlike in previous games where power armor for all intents and purposes was just a better suit of armor with bonus stats like increased carry weight. However, power armor in Fallout 4, and now 76, acts more like a mech suit, the basis of which is the frame. The frame can be used on its own, or pieces of power armor can be placed on the frame. You also have to go through an animation of entering and exiting the armor. This, I think, is more to do with the art style than anything. The representation of power armor in the games isn't always consistent, hence why 3 in New Vegas power armor is the same height as a normal person, despite it being a bulky powered suit. Although the proper idea of a frame was never in the games until Fallout 4 said that's how power armor works, we can at least see traces of a frame-like system in previous games. The T-51B in the original games does have a hatch on the back, indicating it does indeed have to be opened up similar to the new style. We can also see the basis for the frame in Fallout 3, that being the recon armor, as it is worn underneath the T-45 suit. So it's not impossible to see that a frame could exist in the older games. I know some people will say that the original T-51 has to be custom fitted, and that could still be the case, but Fallout is a game, and gameplay is obviously the main focus. So it's not crazy when we see someone wearing armor that doubles their profile somehow fitting into a very specifically sized mech suit. In-universe, I think the flight suit-like uniforms the Brotherhood wears are actually the required final component to operate power armor. As we can see the electronic elements on the suit, it appears to be a similar idea to the recon armor in Fallout 3, in that it would interlock with power armor, not only adjusting the fit of the suit, but providing much needed energy dispersion, so you're not just walking around in a giant conductor. Now, as to why the newer games show power armor with mismatched, missing, or even handmade pieces, I think the skin comes back to the scarcity of the power armor on the West Coast. This and the West has many more major factions. Almost all power armor on the West Coast would have been scooped up by the Brotherhood of Steel or the NCR. both of which are military forces, and while the NCR may be more limited, both would still attempt to keep their armour in good condition. But realistically, the NCR would only have minuscule amounts of power armour given to high-ranking soldiers, as we see with Colonel Royes. The Brotherhood are the main ones with power armour. Alternatively, the power armour we see in the older games may not have frames and removable pieces. They could actually be different models. Perhaps that's why they have the sub-designations of T-45D and T-51B, where the newer games are just T-51 and T-45. Maybe the T-45 was only built around an interchangeable frame when the second model of power armour, the T-51, was developed, and the T-51B is an elite model of the T-51 that can be custom fitted. That's just a possibility though. I think Bethesda is saying that in fact power armour always had a frame. Along with a frame came the introduction of fusion cores, a fuel source required for power armour to operate. In the older games, power armour was powered by a microfusion reactor that would last for hundreds of years. This was updated in Fallout 4 with the introduction of the frame. Again, you could argue that the T-45D and T-51B are actually separate models to the non-letter designated ones, but I'm assuming this is not the case. This one is kind of a mess. This would be just a straight retcon of old lore. However, I can at least explain why fusion cores appear so stupid in the newer games. As I mentioned before, the gameplay is the main focus, and fusion cores are no exception. In-game, the cores expire in a few minutes gameplay, or a few hours in game time. Obviously, this doesn't make sense at all when we look at factions like the Brotherhood that make extensive use of power armor. It will be almost impossible for them to acquire enough cores to power their armor. Even if the Brotherhood could somehow manage this, it would still be impossible for the Atom Cats or Raiders to manage this. It is clear that such short time is only for gameplay purposes, especially considering that NPCs can use fusion cores limitlessly, and also fusion cores can power buildings for hundreds of years. It's not clear exactly how long fusion cores do last for in-universe. There's only two accounts I can think of that mention this at all. The first being the Journal of the Military Survivors in Fallout 76, detailing how their cores were almost dead after they escaped Pittsburgh. It's not clear when exactly this is, but it seems to hint towards it being close to Fallout 76's setting, around 25 years after the war. And keep in mind, these soldiers would have been travelling in this armour the whole time, not sitting in a bunker for decades. The next account is a holotape of Brotherhood Recon Squad Artemis scuttling their power armour, the reason being that the cores were around 5% and they didn't want the enemies gaining them. This I find inconsistent. I'm sure the fusion cores would degrade over the hundreds of years, but not this much. There would have to be another reason. It may be possible that they left without fully charged cores, expecting a short mission. I also find it likely that at this point the Brotherhood would be using civilian-grade cores like the ones found in generators, as I assume that there would have originally been military-issued cores that should be superior, however they would no doubt be scarcer. Now that we've worked our way through frames and cores, let's move on to power armor training. This inconsistency is sort of an isolated one, as it isn't featured in the original games, so it's not original lore, and it's not in the latest games, so it's not part of the new canon either. Power armor training is only in Fallout 3 and New Vegas. The reason for this, I think, is that the characters in Fallout 3 and New Vegas are, on a certain level, weaker. Fallout 1's Vault Dweller was sent on a mission by the Vault into the Wasteland, so it's possible the Vault Dweller was given some sort of training in the Vault. Fallout 2's Chosen One is the Chosen One, a god among men, talented at everything, easily able to work power armor. But Fallout 3's Lone Wanderer is just a random kid that ran away from the Vault. New Vegas's Courier is also no one special, although highly skilled, not on the level of the Chosen One, and with no known background that would yield power armor knowledge. Then Fallout 4's sole survivor, Nate, was in the army and would almost certainly know how to operate power armor. I don't however think Nora would be able to. It's possible Nate told her some basics, but I think canonically Nate would have been the sole survivor. Finally, with Fallout 76's Vault residents, they were all highly skilled individuals that were prepared from the beginning to venture into the outside world. It's very likely they were taught how to use power armor. As for why the NPCs can use it, this again is because there's more power armor on the East Coast. It may be difficult, but eventually people would learn how to use power armor by themselves, or any ex-military people might teach them and pass the knowledge down. I believe that covers the miscellaneous retcons. Now we'll move on to the actual retcons of each model, starting with the resistances of each, then moving on to the actual appearances of each model in the different parts of the US. Again, this is going off Fallout 76, and it will mostly be fixing problems in Fallout 4. The first inconsistency is for all of the power armor models in Fallout 4. They all have the same radiation resistance. This wouldn't make any sense as they are different in terms of the materials used. The radiation resistance in Fallout 4 actually should increase with the damage resistance with the exception of the T-51, which would have the lowest radiation resistance thanks to its lack of metal. The next inconsistency is with the T-60 in Fallout 4. The lore states the T-51 was the most advanced pre-war power armor, at least publicly known. So the T-60 in Fallout 4 having higher resistances doesn't make sense. Fallout 76 remedies this though. The T-60 is superior to the T-45, but weaker than the T-51 except in radiation resistance. Now finally, pretty much all power armor in Fallout 3. Assuming the T-45 is the basis for comparing everything, then it works. But all the other three models do not make sense. The T-51 is more protective than the T-45. That fits in with the lore. But then the T-51 also has higher radiation resistance. This wouldn't make sense as the T-45 is composed of metal, while the T-51 is largely made up of a ballistic fiber-like material. The radiation resistance would come from the silver coating that would still be more targeted against energy weapons. Then we have the Enclave power armor. The Advanced Power Armor Mark II seems to be very flawed in this game. It's more or less the same as the T-45 in terms of stats. It's obvious why they did this, because the Enclave soldiers are a common enemy and you can't make their armor too powerful, otherwise the enemies will be too hard and it would be too easy to gain extremely powerful armor. I can't say for certain how strong the APA Mark II would be in universe. I think it's possible it could be superior to the Mark I, but I do see a lot of arguments that it would be inferior as it's a more mass-produced model, meant to supply large numbers, not top tier. However, it should be stronger than the T-51 at least, and certainly stronger than the T-45, considering that was America's first proper attempt at power armor. The Enclave have 200 plus years of knowledge to make better power armor, 35 years after the APA Mark I. The T-60 even appears to be just an upgraded T-45. The Enclave also has plenty of production power, with Raven Rock, on top of power armor, being able to produce energy weapons and Mark II vertibird gunships. The Enclave also has a production center at Adams Air Force Base, which leads to the Hellfire power armor that was produced at Adams. This again is affected by balancing, which results in it being the same as T-51. I can accept that the APA Mark II is a mass-produced model that results in it being inferior to the Mark I, though it should still be superior to the T-51, but the Hellfire should not be the same as T-51. The Hellfire really should be the best power armor of all time. This was the high-end power armor of the Enclave. They actually put resources into making it superior. Why doesn't the Enclave use any of their old Mark I suits if these ones are so bad? Now we can move on to the meat of the topic, the placement of each power armor model. For instance, the T-45 not being seen in California, but the X-01 appearing in Boston of all places. To better illustrate the appearances of each model, I will show this info for each, depicting the game and location it appears in. The list will be in order of the armor's creation, although there are some that don't have exact dates. To start off with, the T-45, the first deployed model of power armor, first entering service in 2066. It's also the weakest military power armor, in terms of kinetic resistance at least. It appears in Nevada, DC, Boston, and Appalachia, yet does not appear in California. West Virginia and Boston are pretty simple. As power armor is more common in the East, the T-45 appears regularly. With DC, this should be the case, but we almost never see any other power armor but T-45. I think there's three main reasons for this. First, in-game, every T-45 power armor suit has the Brotherhood logo on it. This may be an oversight, but it can be interpreted that the Brotherhood has control over all power armor in the region, with the exception of the two T-51 suits and the Enclave armor. It's possible that the Brotherhood does have access to some models of T-51, however they don't have the resources to maintain them. The second reason relates again to riot control. DC would have a large military presence, and power armor was used to help in riot control. But perhaps the large number of soldiers in the area gave reason to send more power armor to other places with smaller military presences, like for instance West Virginia. The third, and possibly most important reason, being Colonel Santiago's military remnant. We know that Colonel Santiago and an ambiguous amount of soldiers survived in DC when the bombs fell, then journeyed to the White Spring Bunker in West Virginia. Now allow me to go off on a small tangent. Bethesda really just glances over this and the entire Enclave story altogether. They also underplay it. Colonel Santiago is a colonel. Colonels today typically command brigades of 4,000 soldiers. However, in Fallout it would probably be closer to the World War II brigade size of between 1,500 and 3,500 soldiers. If we lowball it because America was at war and shoving as many soldiers to the front as they could, the number should still be in the hundreds. The survivors would likely rally with other military survivors as well. Colonel Santiago arrived at the White Spring Bunker years after the war. The military did indeed try to maintain control of DC after the bombs fell, but clearly failed as we see what remains of them in Fallout 3. It's quite possible Santiago was the last one in command during this time, and after the situation became hopeless, the remaining military forces led by Santiago left DC for the White Spring Bunker. I think it's such a missed opportunity to not expand on that. But back to power armor. As mentioned, Colonel Santiago's soldiers survived the war. Many of them would have had access to power armor. And as I said, it's likely they rallied with other military survivors. This military remnant in DC would have taken most of the remaining power armor with them, leaving only the surplus T-45 power armor. So it's a combination of reasons that result in there being basically only T-45 in DC. For California, there likely would be some there, however, given power armor's scarcity in the West, it's understandable why we don't see it. Almost all of the power armor we see is actually just from the Mariposa military base, which was working on a top-secret super soldier program. As such, they were supplied with the best widely available power armor, T-51. The appearance in Nevada is thanks to the Brotherhood again. Unlike the Brotherhood in Fallout 1 that occupied a single bunker, the Brotherhood in New Vegas is part of a much stronger and larger Brotherhood that has combed the waste for technology, clearly finding more power armor in the process, T-45 being some of it. This is also the reason for the appearance of the salvaged T-45 or just salvaged power armor. After the NCR's conflicts with the Brotherhood, they obtained many power armor suits from the corpses of Brotherhood soldiers, allowing them to use the remains of the beaten armor. The T-51 likely isn't seen salvaged because it's too complicated to maintain or even repair from the state the NCR would obtain it in, so the only salvaged power armor we see is T-45. Now on to the T-51. The T-51 was the second power armor model to be deployed, 10 years after the T-45 in 2076. The T-51 remains the most advanced pre-war power armor to see full production. The only real weakness of the armor is its poor radiation resistance, and perhaps its complexity. The T-51 appears in every playable area: California, Nevada, Appalachia, DC, and Boston. The T-51 is a much rarer power armor, so its appearance has to be more justified than the T-45. In California, the only power armor is T-51, and all of that power armor originates from the Mariposa military base. This is where the Brotherhood originated from as well. It was part of the FEV Super Soldier program, and as such was given the best gear in the form of top-of-the-line T-51 suits. Almost all of the T-51 in Nevada is Brotherhood owned as well. Some of the T-51 would no doubt be brought from the original Brotherhood chapter, but I assume most of it would be from the Brotherhood looting the region. In Appalachia, most of the T-51 probably comes from the military remnant from DC. It's also possible that more power armor was supplied to West Virginia to compensate for it being one of the smallest states in terms of military personnel. DC only has a total of 2 T-51 suits we can find, one being in the armory of Virtual Strategic Solutions, only accessible via Pip-Boy and then the completion of the Anchorage Reclamation Sim, the other being in the bunker of Fort Constantine locked in a stasis field. This gives off the impression it is an experimental superior model, which might explain why it just has 5 more DT than the winterized T-51 from Virtual Strategic Solutions. As for why there isn't more T-51 in DC, as previously mentioned, Santiago's military remnant likely took most of the remaining power armor in DC with them in the years after the war, and the Brotherhood may have some, but may be too complicated to maintain. On to Boston. At first glance, Boston doesn't seem to have anything special about it that would warrant so much power armor. I think it comes down to Boston's port. We see multiple suits throughout the region that were being transported before the war. I assume these were all being shipped overseas or perhaps to Canada. The T-60. Deployed in 2077, it would mark the last power armor to see full production before the war. Its appearance certainly gives off the impression that at least some of the suits would have been upgraded T-45 suits. The T-60 appears only in Boston and Appalachia so far, so why doesn't this armor appear on the West Coast? I believe it's a combination of the West having proper riot equipment as well as the T-60 being deployed so shortly before the war. Because of these two factors, the T-60 may not actually have made it to the West Coast by the time of the Great War. As for the East Coast, the explanation should be quite similar to the T-51. Appalachia would be supplied with more power armor to compensate for the smaller military, and Santiago's military remnant would likely have brought as many suits as they could with them from DC, explaining why there isn't any in DC. For Boston, again like with the T-51, it was a port city used for transporting the armor to the front lines. The EXC-17 excavator, designed by the Garahan Mining Company for use as a mining tool, which results in it being inferior. The first suit was finished in early 2077, with 2 more completed later. However, the project was scrapped after the competing mining company, Hornwright, proved their auto miners to be superior. This is why we only see the excavator army in Appalachia, because Garahan was based there and they only produced a small number of excavator suits. The T-65, a special suit issued exclusively to the Secret Service in Vault 79. Little is known about it beyond what can be assessed from its location and appearance. The T-65 is acquired from Vault 79, a vault guarded by the Secret Service with the purpose of holding America's gold reserves. From this and its concept art, we can tell its purpose was security for Vault 79. And as I theorize in my video dedicated to it, the second purpose of it being to operate in a post-nuclear world. The T-65 is only found in Appalachia because so far it only seems to have been supplied to Vault 79 in Appalachia. The X-01, not to be confused with advanced power armor. The X-01 was an experimental power armor being developed by the Enclave pre-war. The armor wasn't finished before the war, but at least a few suits were created. The X-01 appears only in Appalachia and Boston, though it should be noted that these X-01 models differ slightly between the regions. The X-01 models in Boston are superior to all other power armor suits available in the Boston area. These were likely left there around the time of the Great War by Enclave operatives. We know that the military was evacuating VIPs after the bombs fell. It's also possible that some Enclave operatives were sent to Boston post-war, but it's not clear as to why that would be. The XO-1 that appears in Appalachia is hinted to be an earlier prototype than the one in Boston. This one is still decent, but not as good. It was built by the Appalachian Enclave and can still be found in their bunker. It doesn't seem like the Enclave was carrying out any operations in DC, Nevada, or California, at least early enough to be using the XO-1. By the time we see them in those areas, they have access to advanced power armor. The Hellcat power armor. We really know nothing about this power armor, apart from the fact that it is used by Hellcat Company and it was created in or before the year 2104. Its stats are nothing special, in fact they're quite poor, but what makes it stand out is the legendary effect on all armor pieces that totals 12% ballistic damage reduction. I go over many different theories of the purpose and origin of this armor in my video on it, whether it be submersible armor, riot control armor, or tank killer armor. It's possible that there is only one prototype, as we see only one character use the armor, but I think it likely that Hellcat Company was just a military unit pre-war, and the Hellcat armor is just a specialized suit that was primarily used by them. Hence why they are the only ones seen with it, and since we've only seen them in Appalachia, we've only seen the armor in Appalachia. It's possible we will see more of them in the Pit Expedition later in the year, but for now this is all we have to go off. The Hellfire prototype. Much like the XO-1 and the advanced power armor, this prototype Hellfire armor shouldn't be confused with the finished Hellfire armor. Although the differences are much smaller in this case, I want to keep this consistent, so I'm recording this as different power armor. The Hellfire prototype is on the verge of not being canon. It mostly just appears as skins in the Atomic Shop, but the entry about it in Vault 51's Overseer terminal, and now the appearance of it on the Overseer of Vault 51 more or less confirms its existence. It's unknown when exactly the Hellfire prototype was first built, but we do know one was sent to Vault 51 in 2080. Due to it only being accessible as a skin, we don't know what the defenses of the armor look like, but it's safe to assume that because we don't see any more bottles in the White Spring bunker, and the fact it's just a prototype, that it probably isn't very good. The Zax in Vault 51 likely requested it because it gives resistance to fire, and this would be a suitable reward for winning in Nuclear Winter. The reason we wouldn't see the Hellfire prototype anywhere else is because the armor clearly wasn't very good. It seems the Enclave pursued the Advanced Power Armor series over the Hellfire until DC, where the Hellfire suit was finished, but I'll cover that last. The Ultrasight model. Originating from the T-51 model, the Ultrasight power armor is a Brotherhood design. This could be considered the first post-war power armor. The Ultrasight model is T-51 that has been modified using Ultrasight, a special element unique to Appalachia, obviously explaining why it's only seen in Appalachia, because the element required to create it is only found in Appalachia. The Strangleheart power armor is also a variant of the Ultrasight power armor that has Stranglevines covering it. How exactly this is created, I couldn't say, but that's what it is. Raider power armor. Handcrafted from junk metal post-war by various raider gangs around the country. The games obviously don't do justice to how each suit would look wildly different. This armor, as you can imagine, is one of the weakest power armor suits. It appears only in Appalachia and Boston. The reason for Raider power armor not appearing in the West is partly because power armor is so rare that raiders are less likely to get their hands on it, but also because power armor in the West is basically all controlled by large factions, the Brotherhood being the main culprit, scavenging and looting all useful technology they find, including power armor. But that doesn't mean the NCI isn't going to snatch up any power armor they find. Similarly, in DC, all of the power armor is controlled by large factions. The Enclave creates their own, and as I've explained, the Brotherhood took control of almost all power armor in DC. So the reason for Raider power armor appearing in Appalachia and Boston is thanks to its abundance and the lack of any major faction in either of the two regions. There's plenty of power armor that we can see lying around in the wastes. eroding and falling apart from the lack of maintenance, many of which Raider gangs repaired with scrap metal and put to use as their own power armor. Advanced power armor. This was the first major improvement on power armor after the war. Likely developed as the finished model of the Exo-1, it was finished in 2215 aboard Control Station Enclave. The Advanced Power Armor, or APA, appears only in California and Nevada. Its appearance in California is obvious, as Control Station Enclave, the place where the APA was finished, is off the coast of California. So when the Enclave began operating on the mainland again, they used the APA as their main uniform. In Nevada, the APA can only be found in a few places, in the hands of the remnants, including Arcade, and on the corpse of a prospector, in the edge of the map. All of these suits are originally from the rig, but after its destruction, they have moved eastward with their owners. The APA does not appear in any other regions because the APA was developed on the rig in 2215, so all of the models would have to come from the rig somehow. The only Enclave cell that we know existed after the rig's destruction, apart from the remnants, is the DC Enclave, and I guess the Chicago one, but we haven't been there. The DC Enclave probably recycled the APA suits into new power armor, or perhaps we just don't see the few troopers who would have these suits still. I mean, for some reason all the Enclave personnel we see in DC, save for Autumn, are pretty young, not old enough to have used the APA on the West Coast. The Advanced Power Armor Mark II Oil Rig version. This power armor appears only on the oil rig in the 2240s. It's unclear if it's the same power armor that appears in DC years later. I would say it's not, as the rig model is superior to the APA Mark I, and it shares the model with the Mark I. So it seems to be a unique prototype Mark II that was likely lost when the rig was destroyed. The Advanced Power Armor Mark II, the one we're more familiar with that appears in DC in 2277 and 2278. This armor ideally should be better than all pre-war armor, except maybe the T-65, but realistically the worst post-war Enclave armor, still outclassed by the APA Mark I and the Oil Rig Mark II, as well as the finished Hellfire. The APA Mark II only appears in DC because the DC Enclave are the ones who produce the armor, and only the DC Enclave because they are the latest Enclave in the timeline, and we only see this Mark II at this time. In California and Appalachia, we visit those places before the armor is even created. With Nevada and Boston, the armor just hasn't made its way to either of those places yet. The Hellfire, the finished one. This armor was only used after 2277 in DC by the Enclave. It should realistically be the best power armor to date. The explanation for the Hellfire is much the same as the APA Mark II. The Hellfire was created by the DC Enclave and only used by them, not making its way to any of the other locations we've visited. Now, why we see them using this armor that was all but scrapped hundreds of years ago in favour of the Advanced Power Armor, I think it's to do with the Duraframe. It's never exactly stated what Duraframe is, whether it be a material or just the actual armor added onto the Eyebots. Whatever Duraframe is, the Enclave badly needed it for the Hellfire armor to work. It seems the Enclave finally found a way to finish one of their old designs that could never be fully realized with the technology at the time. And that, unless I'm mistaken, explains all of the major retcons around power armor. At least until a new power armor comes out in 76.